Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the absolute most massive, completely world-altering phenomena in human history, the rise and fall of the British Empire. We're going to look at how a relatively small island nation, just sitting off the coast of Europe, somehow managed to stretch its influence across the entire globe and, fundamentally shape the modern world right along with it. Now, you've probably heard this famous phrase before, right? Well, it wasn't just some poetic boast. It was a literal geographical reality. The empire became so incredibly vast, so completely widespread, that daylight was actually always touching at least one of its territories across the globe at literally any given hour of the day. And the sheer human scale of this thing, it is just staggering. By the year 1913, the British Empire held sway over roughly 412 million people. To put that into perspective, that was 23% of the entire global population at the time. Think about that for a second. Nearly 1 in 4 people on Earth lived under British rule or administration. And the territorial scale was just as wild. By 1920, the empire covered 35.5 million square kilometers. That is an astonishing 24% of the Earth's total land area. So the obvious question we have to ask ourselves here is, how exactly was this achieved? How in the world did a single nation consolidate this much power? Well, let's start at the beginning. Part 1, Maritime Origins. Let's trace the stepping stones here. Back in 1497, commissioned by King Henry VII, an explorer named John Cabot sailed to Newfoundland looking for a northwest passage to Asia. This really laid the early foundations. But a massive catalyst came a bit later, in 1603, when King James I made peace with Spain. With their main rival temporarily neutralized, England completely shifted gears from just raiding Spanish ships to actively building its own colonial infrastructure. Fast forward to 1757, and the Battle of Plassey marks the conquest of Mughal Bengal, which was a massively defining moment of imperial expansion. Now, the method behind all this early madness heavily relied on something called joint stock companies, the most famous one, of course, being the East India Company. See, instead of just using direct government military conquest, Britain used these corporate entities to administer overseas trade, build infrastructure, and even govern colonies. They were effectively outsourcing the early empire building. By using private capital to fund these super risky expeditions, the crown could expand its global reach without totally draining the national treasury. Pretty clever, right? Which brings us to part 2, the pivot east. So the absolutely crucial point to understand here is that losing the 13 American colonies after the American Revolution, it didn't end the British Empire, not at all. Historians actually often refer to the era before the Revolution as the First British Empire, which was focused heavily on the Americans. Losing those colonies simply forced a massive geographic shift, creating a second British Empire that aggressively pivoted its focus toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. And along the way, Britain was constantly bumping heads with European rivals like France and Spain. But through treaties, like the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, Britain gained highly strategic territories. Taking Gibraltar from Spain, for example, that completely locked down the entry point to the Mediterranean, cementing Britain's naval superiority for years to come. As we move through the 18th and 19th centuries, we see some truly dynamic shifts happening. We've got deep exploration into the Pacific, continued expansion across India, and some really significant domestic policy changes too. Notably, after playing a major role in the transatlantic slave trade, the British Parliament enacted the abolition of slavery in 1833. This was a move that fundamentally altered the economic and social fabric of its colonies. All right, moving into the empire's absolute peak. Part 3, the Imperial Century. Following the defeat of France in the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain was basically left without any serious international rival. Well, except maybe Russia and Central Asia. This ushered in a whole era called Pax Britannica, or British peace. Completely unchallenged at sea, Britain adopted a foreign policy of splendid isolation and essentially acted as the world's global policeman. The sheer volume of growth during this specific century is almost hard to wrap your head around. Roughly 10 million square miles of territory, and about 400 million people were added to the empire between 1815 and 1914. But here's the thing. British power wasn't exclusively limited to the places where they literally planted a flag. There was also this immense informal empire. Because Britain absolutely dominated world trade in the oceans, they effectively controlled the economies and influenced the policies of totally independent nations like China, Argentina, and Siam, which, by the way, is modern-day Thailand. They were pulling the strings from afar. Let's look at how this transition played out in India, often called the jewel in the crown. For a long time, it was ruled by that corporate entity we mentioned, the East India Company. But in 1857, a major rebellion broke out, starting with the mutiny of Indian troops known as sepoys. It was a brutal conflict. It took 6 months and a heavy loss of life on both sides to suppress. The immediate results was the British government dissolving the company entirely and assuming direct rule in 1858, establishing what we now know as the British Raj. Which brings us to the tipping point, Part 4, the descent. Now, this is a fascinating paradox. Britain and its allies won the Second World War. Victory was theirs. Yet, almost immediately after this monumental win, the largest empire in human history rapidly collapsed, like a total domino effect. So why? What happened? Well, this rapid collapse really came down to 3 main pillars. First up, the economic drain. The world wars placed unimaginable, crushing strain on Britain's resources. The country was essentially bankrupt by 1945 and had to rely on a massive $3.75 billion loan from the U.S. just to stay afloat. Second, the geopolitical landscape completely shifted beneath their feet. The U.S. and the USSR emerged as the new global superpowers, and both were generally opposed to old European colonialism. And third, global movements. An irresistible wind of change, a massive rise in anti-colonial movements all over the world, meant Britain had to largely adopt a policy of peaceful disengagement. If there was a single moment, though, that clearly signaled to the entire world that Britain's days as an independent global hegemon were well and truly over, it was the 1956 Suez Crisis. This geopolitical event publicly and somewhat humiliatingly confirmed their substantially reduced status on the world stage. And the speed of this decline? It was absolutely breathtaking. In 1945, there were 700 million people living under British rule outside the UK. Just 2 years later, in 1947, India achieved independence. And by 1965, that number had plummeted from 700 million to just 5 million people. Think about that. In roughly 2 decades, the largest empire in history effectively dissolved. Finally, we reach Part 5, the setting sun. While the bulk of decolonization happened in the mid-20th century, many historians and global observers actually point to July 1, 1997 as the true historical bookend. The handover of Hong Kong to China is widely recognized today as the symbolic, definitive end of the British imperial era. However, you should know that the dissolution didn't mean complete separation. The empire left behind the Commonwealth of Nations, which is a free association of independent states, mostly former colonies. To this day, 15 of these nations, including the UK, still retain the British monarch as their head of state. Additionally, there are actually still 14 remaining overseas territories that are under British sovereignty today. So what should you really take away from this explainer? The British Empire itself might be gone, but from the global prevalence of the English language to common law legal systems and even the modern borders of entire regions in the Middle East, its fingerprints are literally everywhere. It leaves us with a lingering, highly complex question. When you look at a map today or look at global institutions, how much of the world as we know it is still profoundly shaped by the legacies of an empire on which the sun has finally set? Keep exploring.